And now this week marks yet another strategic failure to which so many patriotic young men and women gave their lives or limbs or even peace of mind for. And that is the 21st anniversary of the Iraq War, which began March 19, 2003, with U.S.-led coalition forces exploding into Baghdad as President George W. Bush addressed the nation back home. While the U.S. may have ended its combat mission part in that war under Obama, we still have troops on the ground in Iraq as we speak. Is that a wise decision? Joining us now to discuss is Marine Corps and Army National Guard veteran John Byrnes, a senior advisor to Concerned Veterans for America. John, thanks for being here tonight.
Always great to be on, Kara. Thanks for having me.
Great. So as we've discussed here with you before, you've been deployed to Iraq, also to Afghanistan, but we're focusing on Iraq right now. So looking back these 21 years later, what are some of your reflections about that war?
Well, the Iraq war is now old enough to buy beer legally, which is just incredible. It was 21 years ago on March 20th that I was reporting into my armory in Manhattan to go for a quick training mission and then start guarding the subways, because during the shock and awe phase, there was a fear that Saddam Hussein would set terrorists loose in America. Of course, he had no such power to do that. It's been a couple of months back in my civilian life, and then that fall, in the fall of 2003, I found myself once again training, this time to go overseas. And this week, on the night of St. Patrick's Day and the next morning, I found myself involved in my first firefight in Iraq, March 17th to March 18th. I cannot believe that American troops are still under fire there, are still at risk there. The 2002, as well as the 2001 authorizations for use of military force are still on the books. And it's just incredible that we can't pull these AUMFs off the books, that president after president continues to risk American lives in Iraq for absolutely no strategic reason or national interest reason whatsoever. And it just boggles the mind that we've been in Iraq for 21 years.
It truly does. And of course, we've seen, recently these last few months, a lot of attacks have been ramped up against our men and women in uniform serving in places like Iraq. We have, also there's been issues in Syria, and of course the 3 who were killed in Jordan as well. So, for those who may ask and go, wait, we're still in Iraq, but why? What's the answer? Why do we still have boots on the ground in Iraq? And kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, is it wise for us to continue being there in that sort of presence?
It's not wise at all. We're in a train and advise mission in Iraq. I could speculate. I could say what I suspect about potential intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance going on, and having conventional troops there to cover that. I'm not sure whether that's the truth or not. I do know that we have way too many conventional troops in the theater overall, including Iraq. I do know that when it came to the Syria-Jordan border attack at Tower 22 that you mentioned, that the 3 killed were U.S. Army reservists. Many of the injured were either U.S. Army reservists or U.S. Army National Guardsmen, a fine difference. But they're reservists who normally serve in a civilian capacity, who were ordered to active duty for at least a year to go be put at risk overseas. And those reserve components were designed to be strategic reserves. And ever since October 2001, the Pentagon has seen them as an operational reserve, and they've been in rotation year after year, right? They're on the same rotational cycle in many cases that active duty forces are, or maybe a year longer between deployments than active duty forces have. But it's ridiculous that we are so involved in the world in places that we don't need to be, in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, that we're risking American lives, and we're getting young Americans who are primarily civilians, who are weekend warriors, civilian soldiers. We're getting them killed for nothing in the national interest.
Because that's the thing you'll hear too a lot, right? A lot of arguments of, well, we can't leave X, Y nation. I mean, really any nation at this point, we can't leave, because if we do, it creates a vacuum, we're always told. And in that vacuum, some really nasty players will spring up, and then we'll have to go back anyway. So we might as well stay. But if memory serves me, especially when it comes to Iraq, it seems that it was kind of our meddling that allowed for the rise of ISIS, actually. It wasn't so much the vacuum, but it was what we were doing in Iraq that allowed for these, terrorist insurgent groups to really spring up. And it sadly does seem to be the case that the more our guys are over there, no matter how much humanitarian work that they try and do, no matter how much, good that they try and bring to local communities, there's still foreign troops on the ground. And that, of course, just acts as a giant recruitment board for just terrorist and other type insurgent groups. And so it kind of ends up feeding into the problem that we think we're trying to solve. Or am I perhaps alone in that?
I don't think so. It's been 6 decades of this kind of behavior by, by the Pentagon and by the senior leadership of this country of various political stripes. We didn't learn the lesson in Vietnam. We didn't learn the lesson in Iraq. We didn't learn the lesson truly in Afghanistan. There really are only two choices in countries like that. You either stay and keep things the way you want them, which means essentially, empire, long-term oppression, permanent involvement in those nations, or you leave in a timely fashion. And sometimes that doesn't look as pretty as you'd like to do it behind you, but you do it better than we did in Afghanistan. You leave in a way that protects your forces and protects your people. And we definitely, again, should not be risking any American lives on this 21st anniversary of the Iraq War in Iraq or its neighbor Syria.
And you're so right, and those are really the two options that we have at our disposal. And it seems that the U.S. foreign policy establishment, it's one foot in the door on one side, one foot out the door on the other side, and it leaves our men and women in a lurch, in kind of limbo. Do you think that, obviously, I know this is a pipe dream at this point because there's a lot of money, a lot of power players in D.C., but really we should be focused on, if we do have to intervene because it does serve the U.S. national interest abroad, that we need to make sure that we are clearly defining what we're doing in that nation, why we're doing it, and that when those terms are specifically achieved, we will then leave. Because to me, that's what our military was designed for, right? To go in, to kick some butt and to win, not to play, building nations and all these other games that they want us to play that, again, leaves us in a lurch to where so many say, why are we here? What's going on? So do we need to go back to the idea of clearly defined goals and then sticking to them and sticking to those timelines?
Well, it's the sticking to them that's the hard part, right? When we went into Afghanistan, the idea was we were going to overthrow the Taliban, change the government, and everything was going to be sweet and rosy, and we were just going to move on. Same thing with Iraq, right? We're going to go in, we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and peace and democracy were going to break out. We've consistently underestimated the forces at work in cultures that are foreign to ours, and we've overestimated our ability to control them. And we've had mission creep because of that. We've seen missions explode into long-term 20+ year involvements in countries where we shouldn't have been involved in the first place. Again, Afghanistan, as a first responder down at ground zero on September 11th, I understand why we had to go into Afghanistan. I don't understand why it took till 2021 to get out of there.
No, definitely. And also, do you think there's something to be said about the ethics of it, right? What you were saying a moment ago about sending reservists out, especially to these hot zones in a situation where the Middle East is once again on fire, and yet we don't even protect and serve the veterans that we have here at home. So to me, I think it's almost unethical to keep sending them out when it's not like we're doing much for them at home when they return anyways.
Too many leaders at the Pentagon. You had the example of Mark Milley. I guess you were trying to get my blood pressure up at the beginning of this, who's, as you said, been unaccountable and has failed upwards. Political leadership in the executive branch has failed over and over again to take into account that these are American lives. And Congress has long since abdicated its constitutional duty to hold the executive branch accountable in this case. Folks, if you want to do something about this, Concern Veterans for America, cv4a.org. There's a take action button there, and you could tell your lawmaker that you want him to help end the Iraq War.
Well, John, thank you for your service, of course, and thank you for joining us tonight.